So on this episode of Full Stack Engineering, we have Diana Chou. And Diana, what would you say we're talking about here? Workplace culture? Would that be a good way to describe it?
Yeah, I think that's perfect, actually.
I guess, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a tech lead at GridPoint, an energy management service company. And I've been doing this for just 6 months, actually. So not too long. It's actually my first lead role that I've ever done.
You're skirting around the more fun history. So you didn't start in tech, though. What did you do before? And how did you bridge that gap?
I did not start in tech. That's true, actually. I actually used to be very interested in development economics. And so it took me actually quite a journey to get into tech. I started my career actually not even in development economics, but in management consulting. So I was in one of the big four for about 2.5, 3 years. Did that for a little while. And then actually the way that I got into tech is a little bit of a funny story too. It's really that somebody took a chance on me. And it kind of connects with a little bit of what we're talking about today.
Do you have any concise tips on somebody who would be looking to make that jump, or any kind of advice that you'd give someone kind of in the middle of struggling with that move?
Concise tips.
It can be long-winded too. That's okay.
I tend to be a very long-winded person, so concise is always challenging for me. If I had to keep it brief, I would say if you get started in it and you're not sure if you're good at it, but you like it, keep trying at it, because you never know. It can be easily one of those things, I feel like, that gives you pretty crazy imposter syndrome sometimes. There's just so many really talented and smart engineers around you, and everybody seems to know everything. But I think one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got actually from one of my closest mentors is that everybody has something to offer. And if you really believe that about yourself, that's one of the best feelings in the world. Is you don't know where your contributions can come from, but if you just find people who see those things in you and bring those things out in you, you can kind of just keep that ball rolling.
I guess jumping back to the topic then, talking about workplace culture and how to build that up, but you've got some philosophies around that, but I guess you also kind of have some experiences around that as well. What are some of those things that have shaped your beliefs around that?
I guess I can start with my journey. My mentor always kind of jokes about this, that I was a homeless waif on the street that he kind of plucked off the street and gave an opportunity to. And that was very much how it felt at the time. When I exited management consulting, I felt like I didn't really have any real skill sets. I thought I would get technical in some ways in that career track. And I didn't feel like it gave me really what I needed and very much fulfillment. And I didn't feel like I had very much to offer to anybody. I heard about this opportunity. The startup is actually called Sparta Science. At the time, they were actually hiring junior software engineers. And of course, I didn't have any production engineering experience. But my friend basically encouraged me and told me, hey, give it a shot. You never know what can happen. Maybe they'll really like you and you'll find a place there. And so I took my best shot. I actually studied really hard for a few days beforehand when I heard that I got the interview. And I was up till 3 a.m. The night before, just trying to remember how to code again, because I didn't have actually zero coding experience. I had taken a few computer science classes in school. And so I knew that this was something that I was interested in and that I found fun, but I had no idea what the application of it would actually feel like or look like in the real world. And so it was very much a shot in the dark. So I showed up to the interview very, very nervous and just met the kindest group of people. And I felt so safe there. It was actually a very strange interview forum even. It was me and 8 other engineers, and they just all sat in a circle asking me questions, which sounds kind of intimidating. But if you met these people, you would understand why it actually wasn't. It was actually a really fun experience. And I was really excited to get to talk to them about things that I knew and things that I also had no idea about. The short story on that is my mentor, who was my CTO at the time, basically just kind of laid his chips on me and told me, hey, listen, I know you don't have any experience, but why don't you just join us for a month and you can consider this in the worst case, if things don't work out, a paid boot camp. And if things work out well, then you have a job. And I thought that was just the best deal in the world. And it was so funny too, because I was coming from an industry that, was paying me fairly well, but I took this massive pay cut. It almost felt like probably a demotion at the time and, starting back down at the bottom of the ladder. But I was so excited. I can't remember the last time I was just so excited to start something new and just be on a different venture. It was such an incredible and lucky experience.
That's such an interesting and really cool and powerful thing that you say there too, of you intentionally took a pay cut to be able to get into engineering. One of the things I typically hear is folks who have gone through school, maybe from some CS program, and are struggling to like get a foothold in what they're looking for, especially if they come from another industry and they're trying to get into programming and they think they need to go back to school or they want to try to match their existing salary or something like that. And it's like, well, I don't want to make the switch because I don't want to get paid less. And so do you have any advice for folks going through that, of really having to like weigh that trade-off and decide which pathway you're going to go?
Definitely. I mean, it was a tough decision. It did feel like a step back in a lot of ways. But I think the way I was viewing it is like, this is an investment in myself. And even if this doesn't pan out, I just knew that I was coming from a place where the culture didn't quite jive with me and the work wasn't, fulfilling to me. And so I could either, stick with something and, probably still have a very lucrative career, but be doing something that just didn't make me passionate and excited every day. And I always like to say, we spend so much time at work, 8 hours a day, and this applies in a lot of ways. It just feels so challenging to be stuck in an 8-hour job that kind of makes you kind of dims your light, I think that's kind of how I felt in that career. Is I felt like I was just kind of getting dimmer and dimmer, and I couldn't see where my contributions were really landing and what was coming out of that. And I did still meet wonderful people. I think there's amazing people in every industry. And I think it's more about finding what works for you than it is about I'm not trying to shit on the management consultants out there. Everybody's working hard. It's a very cool career too, but it just wasn't for me. And I think that was the big thing, is just realizing that I didn't feel like I was in my own skin in that job.
You had on a really important distinction there too, of you made an investment in yourself. So you weren't just looking for the next job. You were looking for how to grow and really something that was going to take things to a different level.
I think something else that is incredibly important there to highlight is knowing what you want. And yes, sometimes it does take a little bit of a pay cut here and there, but you're going to accomplish and get to a point where you're going to be working with either technology or something that you really want to work in. And there's the clear distinction there where you're just lugging through your day at a 9-to-5 job and hating it versus doing something about it and actually loving where you work.
So you mentioned a really positive experience here, and also kind of your journey along the way. How does this start tying into the cultural aspects?
I felt like I grew up in that community. I felt like people really kind of took me under their wing. And this was an extreme programming shop. So we were pair programming 8 hours, 9 hours a day. But there was incredible work-life balance too. You came into the office and you put in your time and there was nowhere to hide. You're working with someone every hour of the day. And I remembered when I first started, I was so ambitious about it. I thought I was going to be studying every night, working, crazy hours the way I had been and had gotten used to doing it. And then I realized it was just completely unsustainable. I was exhausted at the end of the 8 hours. It was the most tiring 8 hours I'd ever worked, and also the most productive 8 hours, that I'd ever felt. And I felt this incredible energy where everyone was so highly collaborative and communicative and supportive of each other. There was never any blame, despite the fact that we all knew, all the lines of code that every other person was writing because we could see it happening in front of us. It was just such a incredibly kind and nurturing place to grow. And I'm always so grateful for that. And I think because of that, I always think of, the kind of environment that I would want to always work in, and the kind of environment that I would want to build for others to work in and influence others to be able to enjoy. And that's kind of how it feeds into the culture. Is I feel like I grew up there and now I want to share it with everyone because I think it's just the best thing ever.
So how do you describe that ideal culture? Is it everything in that workplace that you're describing, or are there other elements that you like that weren't there, and some elements that were there that you don't like or would rather do without?
I think the way that I would describe it is it was a very easy place to be myself. There was very, very little judgment. There was a lot of curiosity. I feel like I'm parroting a Ted Lasso TV episode now, but there's a fantastic TV clip actually in that show that my partner, who's also an EM, actually shared with his team. And so I think it really buys into the story of just being curious about people, being curious about the things that have been previously done in a code base, being curious about previous decisions, architectural decisions that were made for a project, as opposed to judgmental, goes a really, really long way. And what I mean by that is I think it's very, very easy to want to kind of collapse into, like the difficult obstacles and want to find a reason for why you're in the rut that you're in that isn't you or isn't the people necessarily around you, but is like maybe some past decision or something that one person did. And it's sometimes it can be very easy to want to justify those things. But I think the reality of it is software development and most jobs are really challenging. Most workplaces, there's a lot of things that you don't anticipate can happen, a lot of things that you don't prepare for. But at the end of the day, in that culture where I was working, it was always more important to say, hey, this is a problem, but it's okay. Let's band together. We got a lot of smart brains here. We got a lot of good people here and great energy here. Let's figure it out together. And it doesn't matter how we got here or why we got here, but we know that we can find a way forward. And that to me was just the most special thing about it, is that I just always felt so comfortable because I always also knew I was in such a psychologically safe place. There weren't people, looking at every line of code that I was writing and judging me or wondering, how I even got this job or whatever it might be. It was very warm and just welcoming and just all encompassing. People were just always ready to kind of go in all together on things.
You mentioned communication and collaboration as well. And that's something that you'll see across the board on like every job posting or every company's description of themselves or every type of working environment of like, we communicate and we collaborate. But obviously there's not only different levels of that, but sometimes just flat out lies in that. How do you describe effective collaboration and communication? Like, what is that actually working correctly?
I have a very firm belief that if everybody was just a little bit more vulnerable, a little bit more transparent, and a little bit more caring toward one another as human beings in the workplace, that actually that communication and collaboration happens a lot more naturally. And this is a little bit from my own personal experience too, because I came from a culture that was actually quite different than that. So I feel like now I've experienced almost both extremes. And I've seen what one can do, and I've also seen what the other can do. And I feel like when I was working in consulting, there were a lot of like political games, like at very high levels, nuances of things that I didn't even understand. I had a really hard time working in that space because it felt like sometimes we were spending more time on like messaging and on trying to convince people of things than on actually just collaborative ownership of something that like, and building something really cool. There's a lot I actually want to say on that front. I can tell you a story actually about a manager of mine that actually gave me some career advice that I don't agree with. Essentially what happened is this was the first like bad performance review that I'd ever gotten at the company. And it wasn't even a really negative one, but it was like, below average. And it, kind of knife in the heart a little. As an overachiever, I was like quite devastated when I got it. And I was really curious what the feedback would be. And my manager actually told me, hey, listen, you are too open and transparent a person. You say too many things and you reveal too much about yourself. And sometimes it can make you come off as unprofessional. And I'm really just saying this for the good of your career because I know you're climbing this ladder, but you should really keep more things to yourself and keep your cards closer to your chest and not show too much of who you are. And I struggled with this feedback. I remembered contemplating it and thinking, really thinking about like some of the things I'd done in the past. And some of the things he'd pointed to were like, for example, if he would ask me, oh, what were you up to last night? And I would say, oh, I went to dinner with my partner. And you would say, you should have been working. You should have been ordering food in and working. And so that makes you come off as a slacker and things like that. And so I'm sure there is a line here as far as like what is appropriate to say in a workplace. But as far as being yourself and being like a real human being goes, I decided that I just would not compromise on that. And the reason is because I want to be myself. I want to be my authentic self. And that doesn't mean that I don't have things that I can work on and improve on and things that I want to get better at. But it also means that I don't want to pretend to be someone, like wear a shell and be someone that I'm not, because it just sounds exhausting and not the way that I want to live my life. And B, I think there's a place for everybody. If you find that you're not fitting somewhere, it's not because there's something wrong with you. It's just because you haven't found the right people to appreciate you yet, or the things that you have to offer. And I really, truly believe this. This ties back into the words that my mentor spoke to me back when I thought I had nothing to offer, that I really think everyone has something unique to offer. And if you're not yourself, then you really lose that. And I think that makes the workplace and really, frankly, every aspect of our life a lot less magical and a lot more mundane.
And I can also say, just from knowing you, you're also definitely not an underachiever. So someone missed the mark on that. What are some of those consequences that you've seen of not being open, not being vulnerable, not being able to like truly form those connections with people and kind of having that guard up?
In all honesty, I think it can manifest in a lot of different ways, but certainly one of them is fearfulness. Something that always makes me really sad to see, especially in younger individuals, is when people are really afraid to ask questions. And honestly, this happens to me still all the time too. You know, I consider myself old now, but but I definitely still get nervous and still, you know, feel insecure about things and still feel imposter syndrome all the time. And it really takes like being in an environment that fosters like a lot of affirmation and just kind of that psychologically safe space in order to create that energy. And it helps when the person that you're talking to is also vulnerable with you, because it's very, very difficult, I think, to connect with people if you aren't your real self with that person. I think there's like difference between kind of connecting personas and a difference between connecting as real human beings. I've just found that people are so much more able to really ask the right questions and show up and participate and be engaged when they feel that no one's going to judge them for it, but people are actually excited to hear from them, and that there are no stupid questions, and that everybody has bad days and groggy brains and tough mornings, and, you know, just life can be tough sometimes, right? And so it's really about coming to the table with that empathy for one another.
You touched on fear. And so in that vein, what's courage?
In all honesty, Alex, I think it takes a lot of courage to be ourselves. I think being in our own skin and putting ourselves, our real selves out there and wanting people to accept us and appreciate us and love us is really, really hard. When you show up as the real you and you don't get good feedback, that hits home a lot harder than if you're showing up as somebody else. If nothing else, I think that is the most courageous thing you can do, is to be open with people, to be yourself with people, and really just, you know, take that coin flip of, is this person, you know, going to be that person who connects with me or not? And the other thing about that is it's okay if they're not. And maybe 90% of the time they're not. But if it's 1% to me, or if it's 0.5% to me, that 0.5% is worth it, because those connections are so meaningful and so valuable. And I've carried some of them with me for way longer than I think I would have ever expected to.
In an industry of imposter syndrome, fear definitely plays a huge part there. And so one of my answers to that would be, courage is not being like, oh, look how great I am in this awesome thing I did and I saved the team and whatever. Courage is being afraid of something and doing it anyway.
Very true. Very true.
Everybody is afraid of something. Everybody has something they haven't done before. Everybody has something that's new to them. One of those big mental barriers to folks can be limiting themselves by those thoughts and those fears, versus another group of people that it's not that they don't have those fears, it's that they don't let them stop themselves, right?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think even more so, if it scares you, you absolutely need to try it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great reason to lean into it. There's another attribute in there too, and that's jealousy. So how does jealousy play into all those things as well?
I don't know that I've thought a lot about this, but my instinct on it is I find myself these days often more filled with admiration than I am with jealousy.
You've obviously achieved some stuff to where this isn't a blocker for you. But for other folks, what about people you're trying to work with who are jealous of you? How does that connection work? And what are some of the factors at play there?
What I was trying to say earlier about admiration, because I certainly have moments where I'm envious of people. You're one of them, Alex. There are so many people who I meet who are more knowledgeable than me, who have better technical acumen, who solve problems in ways that just make me so envious of their ability to think about things creatively and differently. Like when I hit a wall sometimes and I'm like, I have no idea where to go from here. And then I talk to someone and they have 10 ideas out the gate. You know, I'm envious of that for sure. But I think what I've found works for me is when I meet people that I'm envious of, I really want to learn from them. I want to know what it is about them that gives me envy. And it makes me more and more want to grow in that direction because they have something that I want, or they are something that I want to be more of. That aspect actually helps me a lot because when I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh, I just wish I could just take all the knowledge in their brain and imbue it into my own head. I know that's not possible, but I know that I can learn from this person. I can engage with them. I can even learn how they learned all the things they learned and all the trials that they went through to get to where they are. Because while some people are born magical, a lot of us also work really hard. A lot of us have really cool history that have made us who we are, have developed really awesome habits and really made concerted efforts to be what they are. And I think it's very easy to, in a single glance, look at someone and just envy them for what they are because you can't fathom maybe being that way yourself. But you have no idea what went into it. And so having that communication and connection with that person actually gives you a route into understanding that even better. I can't see a better way than that than, sulking about not being what they are or having what they have.
You touched on a couple great things there. Number one is approaching those people and getting to know them. And the truly impactful people most likely got there because they put lots of hard work into it. They weren't born that way, right? They consciously made an effort to get there. It's like the other side of the coin of that too, that I typically don't see people thinking about is, what did that person have to give up to get there? You probably had to make a trade-off, or, several trade-offs by the time you've gotten to that point. So you as the person being like, oh man, this other person is so great at blah. Well, what are they bad at? They're not just great at everything. So where are those spots where they have weaknesses? You might be able to help them fill those gaps so you could actually provide some value to them.
I think that's so true. And I think that ties very much back into what we were talking about earlier too, about finding your own way, right? And figuring out what that way is. And it's very easy to admire people for everything that they are, especially when we live in our imposter syndrome skin. But at the same time, I think it's really important that we do evaluate ourselves too, remember all the things that we individually bring to the table. And also, you can marry those two things, right? It can be that you have aspirations because you have idols and people in your life who you want to be so much like. And I'm not always good at this myself, actually. And it takes a family, I think, and a village sometimes to hold you and hug you and make you feel better sometimes. This doesn't come naturally, I think. But sometimes it is a little bit of remember to sit back and acknowledge all the things that you bring to the table too.
Building healthy and highly productive teams can be extremely challenging. And everything that you describe to a certain degree sounds extremely familiar. But now the question becomes, do you think that applying everything that we just spoke about scales with the team as the team grows?
As the team grows, it does become more and more challenging. I think in smaller communities, it's definitely a lot easier to foster trust. I think the second you unravel a larger corporation, we become more and more strangers to one another. But my personal philosophy is it feels like a monumental task, right? When you look at the big picture, you're like, well, if nobody's doing this, then screw this, I'm not doing it. But at the same time, I think that's kind of the problem with that mindset. Because if you start with just yourself and you infect your team, And every one of your team members is also like you, and they work with other teams in the same way. It can infect other teams. And I'm not saying that it's easy or that, I have necessarily seen it, successfully accomplished by myself, by no means. But it is something that I will work so tirelessly to hold myself to. It is something that I will just not compromise on, whether or not I believe it's working, because I want to believe that it works. I want to believe that I can be an infection.
Is there cream for that?
But I really do believe this. It's very cheesy. I know it's very cheesy to, want to be the change that you want to see. But I do think that that's real for me. I think that I have certainly been able to feel connected myself to others. And that experience in itself has been so rewarding that I just don't think I could ever give it up.
So there's another maybe challenging element that goes along with building a culture. Now, of course, this is obviously going to be less a factor when dealing with engineers because engineers are smart and logical and obviously remove emotion from all problems that they're solving. But for other folks, like, how do you deal with prickly people?
It's a really funny question, actually. There have been a few coworkers who I've had in the past who have definitely been very skeptical of who I am and my personality, because I think I come off as quite open and friendly. And in all honesty, I love to embarrass people, so I give a lot of compliments. And I do it unintentionally, but I do kind of love to embarrass people a little bit, so I don't mind it. That's how I am. That's kind of how I've always been. I'll walk down the street and compliment someone I don't know. It doesn't behoove me to do that. I don't know why that instinct exists, but it's always just been a part of who I am. I've had comments before from people who, I've gotten to know over like maybe the course of a year and a half or 2 years. It took someone 2 years to tell me, when I met you, I thought you were full of shit. And I was like, oh, that's fun. Like, what do you mean? And he told me, well, I just didn't feel like you could be that nice. You're always saying nice things to people and you're like, it's just very suspicious. And I was like, that's very reasonable. I can understand how from your standpoint, it's very strange to meet someone for the first time and they just won't shut up about complimenting you. Clearly there's some, ulterior motive here.
I mean, you came from management, so he might be onto something.
Exactly. He was onto me. So I actually thought about that for a while after, because it actually did upset me. My first reaction to that was, oh, shoot, I don't want to come off as a fake person. That's never been my goal. And I've always, been very gung-ho about being me. So do I need to tone myself back to come off more as me? Which is just such a contradiction. And the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. And then I just realized, oh no, this is just one of those handshakes that didn't happen right away. He tried to get to know me and I wasn't his cup of tea. And that's okay, because I'm very bubbly and very loud and kind of aggressive, and it's not for everybody, and it's okay. And so what I realized is I need to keep being myself still. And turns out that over time, if people are stuck with you for long enough, they may start to believe you. They may start to believe that that is who you are, because it's hard to be pretending to be something that you're not all the time that way. And so it took him a long time to come around to it, but eventually he did. And he's actually one of my closest friends. I'm not saying that every story is a success story like that, but all I know is that handshake, it doesn't always happen immediately. Sometimes it may never happen at all, but I think that's okay. I think that's part of the magic of it, is that if people come around to you and do start to appreciate you for who you authentically are, that's still more meaningful than if you tried to be something you weren't and they came around to that.
So you're saying just wear people down and after a while they'll dislike you.
Exactly. Just kindness until they can't stand it anymore. They're just like, tell her you like her, so she'll just shut up about it.
There's an important thing I think you said there, which is be yourself and do your best at being yourself. And in doing that, it's okay if at the end of the day, some people still just don't like you. That's their choice.
Yeah, I think that's really important. This is something I struggled with a lot in my youth. I really wanted to be liked all the time. That could very well be where my habits come from. that I overcompliment people and that I am overly open and vulnerable is that I was probably always looking for that connection and frankly hoping that that connection could happen with everyone and that I could never offend anyone. But I started to realize that in reality, no matter what way you are, you will always meet and find people who don't mesh with you. And that's not a problem of you or that person. That's just the reality of the world we live in because there are so many of us. It would be honestly probabilistically impossible, I think, to even create a robot that everybody liked. It's just not possible in my mind. We're just too different.
And that would also probably be the most bland, generic, boring person ever, too.
But he like hands out like airheads or something, you know, something that people really enjoy.
There's a really interesting phrase that you used, and that is a handshake. You're onto something there. Especially working in a large company, you're going to be confronted with people that either don't like you or are prickly. So you just have to learn how to handshake, how to communicate with them, how to interact with them in such a way where you get what you need done and maybe they get something from you that they need. It's just a matter of interfacing with each other in such a way where everything is smooth and professional. One thing, however, is don't change. Be yourself and continue to be yourself. And there's another thing on the vein of complimenting. What are your thoughts on radical candor when providing direct, honest, and challenging feedback? Because in an environment where people are extremely accepting, I myself found it incredibly difficult at times to get feedback from my peers.
So I have a couple notes. The first is what you were talking about with respects to talking to prickly people. When we talk about prickly here, what I envision is not someone who's prickly by nature necessarily, but perhaps someone who's prickly toward you. And when I think of that handshake and the desire to interface with someone who perhaps doesn't necessarily have the desired interface back with you, I like to lean on patience. You can't rush the handshake. The interface should happen when it naturally happens, because that's uniquely part of you being you and the other person hopefully also being themselves. And so when that handshake actually occurs, it's extra special because maybe it took a month or a year, but rushing it does not do it any good. And so if you're hammering with your kindness and your compliments and you're being yourself and it's not working, I think that's okay. It's not meant to be easy, but I think it's helpful to have a lot of patience because you never know when people will come around. And the other piece of that is, I think it takes having also empathy for the other person. It takes, being curious about why it might be that your interface isn't working. And it's not that you need to change who you are to, mesh with this person, but you can still come to a mutual understanding. And as long as you're continuously transparent and honest with that person, even if they don't want to, they're going to be building trust with you because you're coming to the table as your authentic self and as your genuine self. And hopefully you're coming to the table with so much kindness and empathy that it may convince them to empathize with you a little bit too. And that's, I think, when the magic starts to happen from my experience.
But Diana, what happens if you're up against a sprint deadline and you just don't have time for people to come around to things? Not like this hits too close to home or anything, but are there ways to speed up that process at all?
I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I think this is where the patience comes in. And unfortunately, this is, again, my personal philosophy is it doesn't really matter the context of what you're doing. I think we can always still be like productive together and, helpful towards one another and collaborate with each other. We may not feel initially deeply connected. That comes always with time. And I'm not saying you got to drop everything and just be socializing all the time. That's definitely not the way to go either, especially in a workplace. But I think it's more that those two things happen in their own timelines and shouldn't interfere with one another. So even though you may be feeling a lot of pressure, if you start to stray from your beliefs just because the context of where you're working is changed, I think that really marginalizes the benefits that you would gain from it.
A scenario that comes to mind is I had friction with a coworker a while back, and it took a little bit of my time to figure out how to effectively not only communicate, but traverse the situation. And I realized the individual really just needed a little sense of agency. And once that occurred, it was like night and day difference. And sometimes it just takes just a tiny bit of something to make a huge difference. But it does take time to figure out what that something is, especially on a case-by-case basis. You're 100% right. Patience, tolerance, and time.
And experimenting, it sounds like, too. Because I really believe that it's hard to have the answers, and every person you meet is so uniquely different and will react to you so differently. It takes time. It really does. Like, it takes so much energy, too, to commit into each of those connections. I think that's also the crux of the problem sometimes, is occasionally it may not feel worth it to, expend energy also in deeply thinking about how to connect with people when you already have so much work to do. But at the same time, I think having those connections actually really foster so much productivity, because you create this atmosphere that is just so highly supportive and so highly collaborative. And sometimes I think it's also difficult because if you're talking to people and, working together on things, you may not see the results of it right away. You may not notice today, for example, that I paired on something with someone, and because I was able to work with them directly, I got X and Y done. Sometimes those benefits just add up into this gigantic snowball over time, where you just start to notice oh, wow, we're all leveling up together because of how much we collaborate. The code that we're writing is better quality because I'm not afraid to tell someone what I really think about something, or someone's not afraid to tell me and give me feedback. It's just about that safety. And again, I really mean this. I think as individuals, we need to be more vulnerable with each other, because that is where that safety begins. If you can't be courageous enough to tell somebody else how you really feel and be yourself with somebody else, you can't expect that from them either. And so I think that's the first domino to fall, is just with ourselves. Do we come to the table as who we are? Do we openly approach people? And Avelino, I think you mentioned something really important here too, which is sometimes you meet a person and that handshake may never happen. I think the most effective way to navigate that situation is, again, to be really curious, to try to understand that person before you try to solve for that person. Sometimes we see these relationships as problems. We encounter these difficult, engagements, and we encounter friction, and we think about, how do I solve this problem? But if you don't even understand the problem or who you're talking to, if you don't know this person, it's really, really difficult to come up with that solution. And I think even more so, a lot of the time, I think it's about bringing that person into the fold to figure it out with you together. And that is not easy because that always involves a difficult conversation. But I do believe that those are the conversations that need to happen to build trust. You need to be able to look somebody in the eye and say, hey, we're not doing so hot. I'm not pretending everything's okay. And even though, it's work and I'm trying to be professional, I think we need to air some grievances here so we can work better together. I think we need to get it out of our system and talk through it so we can figure out how better to interface with each other.
I think you just nailed the message for this episode. Is there anything else there that you'd like to leave us with?
I don't think that it's easy to be ourselves in any context. Even in our day-to-day lives with friends and family, sometimes it can be really challenging. I think relationships and forming connections is also a lot of hard work. And I don't think it's a one and done thing either. And so part of what makes it almost easier to maintain connections and relationships with people is being yourself, because you're not trying to craft any kind of particular image that you have to maintain and send out and persist in the world. But rather, once those interfaces happen, they're just connections now that kind of attach to you, that exist. And the ones that don't, that, fall off, it's also okay. They don't even ever have to happen. But I think it's bringing that authenticity forward when it is scary too, that makes all the difference in whether or not those connections ever can happen.
You've had some great insights here for us today. Thank you very much, Diana, for coming on the show. And to everybody else, we'll catch you next time on the next episode of Full Stack Engineering.